The Reaper Core barracks reeked of ozone and damp, rusted iron. Ryen Cross knelt on the floor, his brush rhythmic against the metal plating. Around him, the air vibrated with the screech of blades being sharpened. Laughter echoed off the low ceiling, sharp and metallic. A pair of heavy boots stepped into his line of sight, blocking his path. Without a word, a kick sent his bucket skidding across the room, soapy water splashing over his hands and onto the clean iron. Laughter erupted from the benches. Ryen did not look up. He did not speak. He simply crawled toward the bucket, gripped the handle, and dragged it back to the spot he had just finished. He dipped the brush into the gray water and began again, his knuckles white against the wood. The mockery continued. Names thrown like stones, but Ryen kept his focus on the floor. He knew his place in the hierarchy, but he also knew the weight of the blade he would eventually carry. He scrubbed until his shoulders burned, waiting for the only thing that mattered, the order to deploy. The transport hissed, the ramp falling with a heavy clang against the jagged terrain. Ryen stepped out into the eclipse zone, the air immediately thick and viscous, clinging to his lungs like wet wool. Behind him, the squadmates who had mocked him in the barracks fell silent. They stood on a ridge of obsidian, staring upward. The sky was no longer horizon or cloud, but a churning expanse of indigo and ash. Black veins of raw energy spiderwebbed across the firmament, pulsing with a rhythmic, sickening light. The ground beneath their boots shuddered, a low-frequency vibration that rattled teeth and made the blood feel cold. Ryen gripped his rifle, his knuckles straining as the horizon began to warp, the distance between trees and rocks stretching into impossible shapes. The familiar, orderly world of the core had vanished. Here, physics felt like a suggestion, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of static discharge in the atmosphere. The squad leader barked a command, but the sound was swallowed by the void. They pushed forward into the dark, unaware that the path behind them was already beginning to fray. The tunnel walls groaned, the sound of grinding stone vibrating through the soles of their boots. Without warning, the ceiling buckled. A massive slab of rock slammed down, sealing the exit with a deafening boom. Dust choked the air, turning the narrow passage into a tomb of gray haze. The squad leader lunged forward to clear the debris, but the shadows themselves seemed to coil around his limbs. He let out a strangled gasp, pulled backward into the pitch-black crevices of the wall, and vanished. Silence hung in the dust for a heartbeat. Then, the ceiling began to bleed darkness. From the cracks above, elongated silhouettes detached themselves from the stone. They moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, their limbs shifting like liquid smoke. The Wraithborn had arrived. Ryen raised his weapon, but his hands trembled as he watched the creatures descend. They did not walk, they glided, closing the distance in seconds. With the exit blocked and their leader gone, the remaining squad members stood paralyzed. The darkness in the tunnel deepened, pulsing in sync with the creature's arrival, as the first of the Wraithborn unfurled its jagged claws, ready to strike. A scream tore through the tunnel as a teammate collapsed, his life spilling onto the obsidian floor. Ryen did not look back. He sprinted, boots skidding on loose shale, toward a jagged protrusion in the cavern wall. It was a shrine, weathered and ancient, pulsing with a low-frequency light that cut through the gloom. At its center, a black sword hung suspended in the stone. Ryen lunged, fingers closing around the hilt. The metal was freezing, biting into his palm until the skin broke. Warm blood flowed onto the stone, and the world tilted. A translucent interface flickered violently in his field of vision, scrolling lines of text in a language he had never learned. The system chimed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed in his skull. Reaper system initialized. The sword groaned, a sound like grinding tectonic plates, and he ripped it from the shrine. A shockwave of cold energy surged up his arm, turning his veins dark and forcing a gasp from his lungs. Around the pedestal, the encroaching shadows shriveled as if burned. The weapon hummed, a rhythmic, hungry vibration that synced perfectly with his own heartbeat. He was no longer just a recruit, he was a conduit. Ryen lunged, his feet leaving the ground with unnatural force. He did not swing the blade. He let the sword lead, his arm moving in a blur of black steel. The first Wraithborn dissolved into ash as the edge connected, the energy from its dissipating form rushing directly into Ryen's skin. He felt his muscles tighten, knitting together with a density that made the air feel thin. Violet light bled from his eyes, casting long, frantic shadows against the tunnel walls. He met a hulking beast head-on, stepping inside its reach and driving the blade through its core. The creature shrieked, a sound that died instantly as Ryen twisted the hilt. Black ichor sprayed the floor. He moved again, a rhythmic, lethal machine, tearing through the swarm with terrifying efficiency. Silence dominated the squad's corner of the tunnel. They stood frozen, their weapons forgotten, eyes wide as they tracked the violet glow carving through the dark. Ryen was a blur of motion, indifferent to the blood on his hands, his focus locked entirely on the next target. He was not just fighting the creatures, he was hunting them. The air around him crackled with static, and for the first time, the Wraithborn recoiled, sensing a predator that outmatched their own hunger. The heavy iron gates of the barracks groaned shut behind them, but the silence that followed was heavier. Ryen walked through the main hall, his head lowered, the weight of the sword still lingering in his phantom grip. Men who had laughed at him only days ago now stepped aside, their eyes darting toward the violet residue still clinging to his skin. He stopped at the communal basin to wash, but the others shifted away, clearing a wide circle around him. A conversation at a nearby table cut off sharply. Then, the murmurs began. It was not the sound of respect, but of primal, instinctive fear. They called him the Black Reaper. The name traveled through the mess hall like a cold draft. Ryen reached for a canteen, but the recruit next to him flinched, dropping his cup with a sharp clatter that echoed off the stone walls. No one looked him in the eye. He stood in the center of the room, a ghost among the living, realizing that the battlefield had ended, but the hunt had only just begun. He retreated to his bunk, the whispers following him into the shadows of the rafters, louder than any battle cry he had ever heard. Far from the barracks, in a hall carved from the bones of a lost era, Azrael sat upon his throne. The air here was stagnant, thick with the weight of centuries. A projection flickered before him, displaying the scorched aftermath of the eclipse zone. He studied the violet burn marks on the obsidian floor, his fingers tracing the jagged pattern of the cuts. This was not the work of a recruit. It was a distortion of the natural order. Azrael stood, his shadow stretching across the chamber, and gestured toward the vaulted archway. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their presence flattening the very air. These were the generals, the chosen blades of the Crimson Commander. He did not speak a command. He projected the target into their minds. A name, a location, a death sentence. The generals bowed in unison, their movements fluid and predatory, before turning to exit the fortress. They moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, leaving trails of cold energy in their wake. Outside, the sky darkened. The hunt had moved beyond whispers and into the realm of steel. Ryen was no longer just an anomaly. He was the primary objective for the most efficient killers in the known world. The Reaper Academy loomed against the horizon, a fortress of glass and polished steel that mirrored the cold ambition of its students. Ryen crossed the threshold, the structure vibrating with the hum of 1,000 trainees. He had barely set his pack down in the training courtyard when a group of upper-rankers blocked his path. Their posture was rigid, their gazes sharpened into blades of scrutiny. One stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his own weapon, testing the air for a reaction. Ryen kept his breathing steady, his focus anchored to the floor tiles rather than the hilt of the sword concealed beneath his gear. He offered a curt nod and sidestepped the obstruction, refusing to engage in the petty power plays that defined this place. But the air around him grew heavy. Conversations died down as he passed, replaced by the rhythmic clatter of practice blades. He sensed the weight of a dozen eyes, each one analyzing his gait, his strength, and his composure. He was a wolf among hounds, forced to wear the skin of a student, while the blade in his shadow demanded to be unleashed. He found his quarters, a cell of white marble, and sat on the cold edge of the bed. The academy was a web, and he was the fly that knew exactly how to dismantle the silk. The field mission brought Ryen to the Shattered Reach, a graveyard of stone spires and eroded arches. Dust choked the air, swirling around his boots as he picked through the debris of a civilization long erased. He pushed aside a fallen lintel, revealing a descent into a subterranean vault. The air here was freezing. Ryen descended, his hand hovering near his hilt. The sword began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that rattled his teeth. He reached a central dais where the walls were covered in deep, rhythmic carvings. As he touched the stone, the system interface flared in his vision, decoding the script in real time. The text did not speak of a weapon. It spoke of a seal. The blade was not designed to kill, but to contain a singular, catastrophic entity. Ryen stepped back as the realization hit him. The King of Darkness was not an enemy to be slain, but a force to be imprisoned within the very core of his own weapon. The sword pulsed, turning a deep, sickly hue that matched the carvings. The weight of his power shifted. It was no longer a tool of war, but a ticking clock of cosmic containment. He was the warden of a prison that could shatter at any moment. Ryen passed through the academy gates, the weight of the truth pressing against his ribs. The atmosphere had soured. In the main hall, the overhead projectors flickered and died, plunging the corridor into rhythmic pulses of shadow. Students stopped in their tracks, looking toward the ceiling as the automated turrets swept their sensors blindly across the floor. Ryen leaned against a support pillar, watching the inner circle gather near the command hub. They were not discussing the curriculum. Their voices were low, sharp, and punctuated by nervous glances toward the perimeter. He saw his closest confidant, Kale, adjust a communication device with trembling fingers, ignoring the flickering status lights that signaled a total breach in the security grid. A heavy blast door near the armory groaned, its locking mechanism cycling repeatedly without catching. Ryen tracked the pattern of their movements. They were waiting for something to happen. The air grew thin, smelling of ozone and scorched copper. When a senior instructor sprinted past, clutching a data drive with bloodied knuckles, the silence in the room solidified into a wall of dread. The academy was not just failing. It was being dismantled from within. Ryen gripped the hilt hidden under his gear, his knuckles turning white as he realized the circle had already chosen their side. The betrayal arrived not with a warning, but with the cold bite of steel between his shoulder blades. Ryen gasped, his breath hitching as he slumped forward against a control console. A jagged knife withdrew, leaving a searing trail of pain that radiated through his chest. Before he could turn, a deafening roar tore through the foundation of the academy. The main power conduit ruptured, sending a shockwave that blew the reinforced glass windows outward into the night. Ryen hit the deck, debris raining down as the floor tilted violently. From the smoke-choked crater of the command hub, a presence surged, a towering, ink-black entity that defied the laws of space. The Eclipse Lord emerged, its limbs elongated and shifting like liquid shadow. It reached out, and the students nearby were simply erased, their forms dissolving into dark mist upon contact. The ceiling groaned, then collapsed in a thunderous avalanche of steel and concrete, burying the remaining halls. Ryen pulled himself toward a jagged piece of wall, blood pooling on the floor beneath him. He watched the entity tear through the remaining barriers with effortless, rhythmic swipes. The academy, once a fortress of progress, was now a tomb of burning rubble and screaming shadows. Ryen coughed, the metallic tang of blood coating his throat. He pushed against a slab of twisted rebar, his muscles screaming under the strain. Above him, the sky had abandoned its natural cycle. Wide, jagged fissures of purple energy bled into the atmosphere, stretching from the horizon to the zenith. He crawled toward the edge of the crater that was once the main courtyard. Every breath was a labor. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning ozone. He looked toward the city. The skyline was failing. Massive structures groaned and buckled as the ground beneath them softened into a viscous, tar-like substance. In the distance, other dimensional rifts had opened, mirroring the disaster at the academy. Thousands of small, dark silhouettes swarmed the streets below, tearing through the remaining defensive lines with mechanical efficiency. Ryen gripped a shard of metal to force himself upright, his vision swimming with dark spots. He took a step, his boots sliding on the slick. obsidian-stained stone. The world was not ending in a single moment. It was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. He looked up at the expanding void, the light of the eclipse washing over the ruins, and felt the cold, rhythmic hum of the sword responding to the carnage. The descent had only just begun. The atmosphere buckled. Great, rectangular tears in the fabric of reality shuddered open across the horizon, suspended in midair. Through these jagged gates, the Wraithborn poured like water from a broken dam. The human resistance had established a perimeter in the valley, but it dissolved in seconds. Heavy artillery fire struck the vanguard, but the projectiles passed through the entities as if they were smoke. The front line buckled, then shattered. Soldiers retreated, their boots kicking up clouds of ash as they were overrun by the relentless, shifting swarm. Thousands of dark, elongated forms surged forward, their movements synchronized and silent. Ryen stood amidst the wreckage of a command vehicle, his gaze fixed on the endless stream of entities flooding the world. He felt the sword against his palm, its weight grounding him as the ground vibrated under the weight of the encroaching army. The air pressure plummeted. He stepped over a discarded shield, his posture shifting into a combat stance. He did not look back at the fleeing survivors. The tide of shadow reached the edge of the crater, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Ryen tightened his grip on the hilt, his knuckles white, and braced his weight against the incoming impact. The final stand began with the first swing of his blade. The first wave of Wraithborn hit him with the force of a landslide. Ryen went down, pinned under a mass of writhing shadow, his ribs cracking against the debris. He did not let go of the blade. He reached deep into the core of the Reaper system, forcing the interface to bypass every safety protocol. A violent, white-hot static surged through his veins. The air around him ionized, snapping with sparks of violet lightning. He screamed as his physical form began to burn away, replaced by layers of shifting, spectral plating that locked into place with the sound of grinding glass. The shadows pinning him shriveled, disintegrating upon contact with his skin. Ryen surged upward, his feet clearing the ground as immense wings of dark, solidified light unfurled from his shoulder blades. The ground beneath him cracked under a sudden, localized spike in gravity. He stood in the center of the swarm, a towering figure of impossible density. His eyes flared with a steady, blinding violet intensity. The Wraithborn recoiled, their coordinated movement faltering as they faced the radiating pressure of a godslayer. Ryen raised the blade, and the weapon hummed with a sound like a dying star. He was no longer just a man. He was the threshold. Ryen lunged forward, the air parting around him as he carved a clean, glowing arc through the center of the horde. Every swing of his blade sent waves of violet energy cascading across the field, vaporizing the lead vanguard instantly. He did not stop. He moved with a rhythmic, machine-like precision that crushed the monsters into dust. Survivors, previously huddled in the trenches, saw the flash of his wings and broke their retreat. He slammed his blade into the ground, creating a shockwave that knocked back the encroaching wall of shadow, opening a clear path for the human infantry. "Advance," he signaled, his voice cutting through the roar of battle like a bell. The soldiers followed, bolstered by the sight of the glowing anomaly tearing through the swarm. He danced between the strikes of massive, clawed beasts, his movements fluid and calculated. Where he stepped, the ground stopped shaking. The Wraithborn faltered, their hive mind disrupted by his overwhelming presence. He became the anchor point for the entire front line. Under the violet glow of his wings, the line of battle shifted. The tide of shadow, once unstoppable, began to buckle and recede as Ryen drove the counteroffensive deep into the heart of the enemy formation. Ryen crossed the threshold, and the sky behind him folded like bruised parchment. He was no longer in the physical world. Here, the eternal eclipse hung as a tear in existence, bleeding raw shadow into the void. Gravity pulled in 3 directions at once. He forced his way forward, his boots crunching against ground that shifted from solid stone to liquid darkness with every step. The air screamed. It was a high, metallic shriek that vibrated in his teeth, caused by the friction of 2 dimensions grinding against each other. He looked up. Ahead, a throne of jagged, calcified shadow loomed in the center of the distortion. It was not built, but grown from the misery of 1,000 dying worlds. Every movement Ryen made sent ripples through the static, causing the environment to flicker and stutter. He felt the pull of the King of Darkness, a cold, gravitational drag that threatened to hollow out his chest. He tightened his grip on the blade, the metal pulsing in rhythm with his own heart. He walked toward the throne, ignoring the space that bent and snapped around him. The void ahead began to bleed violet light. The King of Darkness waited in the center of the silence. Ryen stopped, his wings flared, and the final confrontation began. The King of Darkness moved, a blur of absolute shadow that ignored the laws of distance. Ryen raised his blade just as a spear of condensed void slammed into his guard. The impact sent a shockwave through the folding dimension, forcing the sky to crack like glass. They collided in the center of the void, their blades locking with a sound that tore through the silence. Ryen pushed back, his wings expanding to burn away the encroaching dark. Every time their steel met, the floor beneath them dissolved into dust, leaving them suspended in the empty space between realities. The King of Darkness struck, a relentless flurry of blows that carved lines of static into the air. Ryen parried, his arms straining against the weight of the shadow, his own blade glowing with a blinding violet intensity. He drove his shoulder forward, forcing the king back, and swung. The strike missed the throat but sliced through the throne, shattering the calcified structure into a million drifting shards. They lunged again, a brutal exchange of light and shadow that caused the very fabric of the dimension to buckle. Neither retreated. The sky above them fractured into jagged, white fissures, and the ground ceased to exist entirely, leaving them suspended in a storm of their own making. Ryen saw the fracture in the King of Darkness's defense. He dropped his guard, ignored the shadow blade grazing his ribs, and lunged. His sword bypassed the armor, sinking deep into the pulsating, violet heart of the Eclipse core. The impact vibrated through his very marrow. The King of Darkness shrieked, a sound that shredded the remaining atmosphere. But Ryen did not pull back. He gripped the hilt with both hands and pushed. The core began to liquefy, leaking raw energy that surged up the blade and into his own body. He felt his Reaper system screaming as the power was forcibly stripped away, layer by layer. The spectral armor on his limbs dissolved into ash. His wings of dark light flickered and died, leaving him exposed to the crushing pressure of the collapsing dimension. He held his ground, heels digging into the dissolving reality, as the core imploded. A white-hot shockwave erupted from the point of contact, erasing the shadow beasts and the throne alike. The void folded in on itself, pulling the light and the dark into a single, infinitesimal point. Ryen's grip on the blade loosened as his strength vanished. The final seal snapped shut with a thunderous, vacuum-sealed thud. The dimension went perfectly, deathly still. The blinding white light lingered for a heartbeat, then fractured into thin, harmless sparks that drifted into nothingness. Where the heart of the eternal eclipse had once pulsed with chaotic energy, there was now only the cold, still air of a dead dimension. The ground, or what remained of it, was solid and unresponsive beneath the soles of boots that were no longer there. Ryen Cross had vanished. No body remained. No trace of the spectral armor or the dark wings lingered in the silence. The air, once thick with the metallic taste of ozone and decay, began to clear. Outside the zone, the sky began to knit itself back together. Clouds rolled in where the jagged fissures had been, and the permanent shadow that had choked the landscape for months finally broke, allowing the first unfiltered rays of natural light to touch the scarred earth. The silence was not empty. It was the heavy, steady rhythm of a world beginning to breathe again. Trees that had been withered by the void slowly regained their color. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp soil rather than burnt iron. Far below, the survivors stepped out from their hiding places, looking up at a sky that was finally impossibly clear. Ryen was gone, but the weight of the dark had lifted with him. Years passed, and the scars of the war faded into the geography of the land. In the heart of the capital, where the central square once housed the seat of power, a new landmark emerged. The black sword remained, embedded deep into the stone of the plaza, anchored as firmly as if it were still held by a hand of iron. It stood motionless, its surface etched by wind and rain, no longer pulsating with the hungry core of the void. Citizens moved around it in their daily routines, their footsteps echoing against the polished pavement. No one could pull the blade from the granite. It defied every effort, remaining a permanent fixture of the city skyline. Children played in its shadow, unaware of the history bound to the steel. The air around the monument remained still, carrying no trace of the energy that once threatened to tear the world apart. It served as a silent anchor, a grounded reality in a society that had learned to value the simple consistency of natural light. The sword did not speak, yet it marked the exact spot where the threat had been contained. The man who had wielded it was a memory, but the monument stayed, a cold and quiet testament to the price of the dawn.